Evolution of the Indian Constitution. Company Rule 1773 to 1858 established Dunnon's framework under East India Company. So, let's talk about how our Indian Constitution evolved over time. It all started with what we call the Company Rule from 1773 to 1858. This was when the East India Company basically set up the first governance framework in India. Regulating Act of 1773. This was pretty significant findings. The British Parliament decided they needed to regulate the East India Company for the first time. Warren Hastings became the first Governor General during this period. What did this act actually do? Well, it established a centralized administration in India and formally recognized the company's political and administrative authority over our territories. They appointed Warren Hastings as the first Governor General of Bengal with a four-member executive council to assist him. They also set up the Supreme Court in Calcutta around 1774. Company officials were prohibited from engaging in private trade or accepting bribes, which was, a good thing considering how much corruption there was. The Court of Directors had to report on revenue, civil, and military affairs to the British government. And Bombay and Madras presidencies were made subordinate to Bengal's Governor General. From an exam perspective, you should remember this as the first step toward parliamentary control over Indian administration. Basically, the British were tightening their grip on our country. Amending Act of 1781, Act of Settlement. Warren Hastings was still the Governor General when this came about. This act kind of limited the Supreme Court's jurisdiction by exempting the Governor General and Council for their official acts. It also excluded revenue matters from Supreme Court jurisdiction and, mandated the application of Hindu and Muslim personal laws for respective defendants. Appeals from provincial courts now went to the Governor General in Council. The Governor General in Council was empowered to frame regulations for provincial courts. This is the first attempt to separate executive and judiciary powers in colonial India. Pitt's India Act, 1784. This happened during Warren Hastings' time too. The act established a dual government system that separated commercial and political functions. So there was this board of control that managed political affairs and supervised civil military operations and revenues. And then the court of directors that oversaw commercial affairs. This was actually the first official reference to company territories as British possessions in India. Right? They were no longer being subtle about their intentions. The Act granted the British government supreme control over Indian territories. Our sovereignty was being eroded bit by bit. Act of 1786. By this time, Lord Cornwallis had become the Governor General and was also appointed as Commander-in-Chief. This act granted the Governor General power to override council decisions in special cases. It marked the beginning of increased executive authority in British India, basically giving them more power to do whatever they wanted without much opposition. Charter Act of 1793. During John Shaw's time as Governor General, they extended those override powers that were granted to Cornwallis to future Governors General and Presidency Governors as well. The Governor General's control over Bombay and Madras presidencies was enhanced. They also extended the company's trade monopoly for 20 more years. They specified that the Commander-in-Chief wouldn't automatically be a council member and mandated payment for the Board of Control from Indian revenues. Charter Act of 1813. Lord Minto was Governor General during this time. This act ended the East India Company's trade monopoly in India, except for China trade and tea. It asserted British Crown sovereignty over company territories and empowered local governments to impose taxes on us. The company's rule was extended for another 20 years and the Board of Control's powers were enhanced. They also allowed Christian missionaries to operate in India. They mandated an annual investment of 1 lakh rupees in Indian education, though this was more about creating English speaking clerks than actual education. They required separate accounts for territorial revenues and commercial profits. William Bentinck was the Governor General of India when this act came into effect. This was kind of the final step towards centralization, giving British India an all India character. It legalized British colonization, and the company became an administrative body holding territories in trust. The company's monopoly on China trade and tea ended as well. They remained the Government of Bengal to Government of India and the Council to India Council. The Governor General of Bengal was now designated as the Governor General of India with 4 civil and military powers. Legislative powers were transferred from Bombay and Madras to the Governor General of India. Laws were now termed acts instead of regulations. The Governor General was empowered to amend or repeal laws in British India. There was a proposal for open competition for 7-7 selection, but this was opposed by the Court of Directors. They weren't really keen on Indians entering the civil service, right? They established the Indian Law Commission in 1834, chaired by Lord Macaulay, for legal codification. Macaulay, I must say, had very little respect for Indian traditions and knowledge systems. Lord Dalhousie was the Governor General of India during this time. This was the last in the Charter Act series that ran from 1793 to 1853. It separated the legislative and executive functions of the Governor General's Council and introduced local representation in the Indian Legislative Council, 6 new members, making a total of 12. The Board of Directors was reduced from 24 to 18 members, with 6 nominated by the British Crown. The Legislative Council functioned as a mini parliament following British procedures. They finally implemented an open competition system for civil service recruitment, allowing Indian participation. But the exams were held in London, so how many Indians could really participate? The Macaulay Committee was appointed in 1854 for civil service reforms. The fourth law member gained voting rights as a full council member. So that's how, the colonial legal framework evolved over time, each act giving more power to the British while creating this facade of governance reforms. These acts laid the groundwork for what would eventually become our constitution after independence.